A rusted brass key turns in a lock that has not been opened since a woman with silver hair last shut it 13 winters ago. The cabin behind that door has kept its secret in the cold. Bell Orchard Lane in the Blue Ridge foothills. Rain on wet cedar, a rutted lane cutting between rows of trees that look dead and are not. At the end of the lane, a small building the family has called worthless for 40 years. Above the door, four rusted screw holes wait for something that was taken down and never put back. Inside the cabin, a young woman in muddy funeral shoes sets a blue mug on a dusty table. She is 20 years old. She has $52 in the bank and 11 in her coat pocket. A mouse scratches slowly inside the wall as if it has been waiting to see whether she plans to stay. Behind her on the pantry wall, a hand that could barely hold a pencil has already written her name. The morning I signed the papers giving my oldest brother our grandfather's house, my hands still smelled like the ointment I had rubbed into an old man's shoulders the night before he died. My name is Sadie Whittaker. I am 20 years old. I had been living in a back bedroom in the Blue Ridge foothills of North Carolina for 14 months. And by the end of that January afternoon, I would understand that a woman who had been dead since I was 7 had been waiting for me to walk into a place my family had spent 40 years calling worthless. What I found in a cabin at the end of a rutted lane 3 weeks later would send my brother into a courtroom he never expected to see. It would give 13 women, most of them older than me by decades back, a name they had lost. And it would put a piece of white tin above a leaking porch that changed what an address could mean. But to understand how a brass key and a rectangle of enamel brought down a story my family had told itself for 4 decades, I need to take you back to the Tuesday my grandfather stopped breathing. He was 78. He had been my only home for 14 months, and I was wearing borrowed shoes. The rain at the cemetery came down at an angle, not enough to soak us, just enough to mud the ground under the folding chairs. Red clay climbed the narrow heels of my mother's old funeral shoes, the same soil my grandfather used to crumble between his fingers before deciding whether it was time to plant. The preacher used the voice they use for men who lived past 70 and died of something reasonable. He called Emmett dependable, a good neighbor, a quiet man who kept an orchard he had let go to seed. Nobody named the 14 months. Nobody named the granddaughter who had moved into the back bedroom the November before last and had not left. Nobody named that on his last afternoon he had called me by my mother's name 3 separate times. Camille died 5 years ago. I was 15. He knew that. He also did not know that. Both things were true at the end. 2 mornings before I had sat at his bedside reading him the sports page, in a voice that pretended not to know, he could not follow it anymore. He had reached up with the hand that still worked and touched the sleeve of my sweatshirt and said, "Camille, I'm cold." And I had said, "Grandpa, it's Sadie." And he had said, "I know, girl, I know." Camille was cold too. That was the last thing he told me that meant more than one thing. My oldest brother Beckett stood on my left in a dark coat he had bought new for the service. My middle brother Judd stood on my right in one of Emmett's old jackets from the hall closet. Neither of them noticed the difference. Beckett kept his hand on my shoulder in a way that anyone watching would have taken for holding me up. He leaned close near the end of the prayer. His breath smelled of coffee and the mint he had chewed in the car. Hensley was meeting us at the house in 40 minutes, he told me. We should get it done while everyone was still around. The dirt was still open. I could see it past the shine of his shoes. I did not answer. I did not need to. Beckett had never asked a question that required one. Back at the farmhouse, the casseroles started arriving before the hearse had cleared the county road. Ambrosia salad, tuna noodle, a ham with a paper flag stuck in it from the Presbyterian ladies at the church my grandmother used to attend. Somebody had left half-a-pound cake under a plastic dome, one careful slice missing, as if the person who cut it had thought better of the whole idea. The kitchen smelled like funeral lilies and menthol chest rub. I had scrubbed that counter the night before. The bedside cup with the green straw was still on the nightstand in his room, bent toward the place his mouth had been. I had meant to throw it away before people came. Then the funeral home arrived early, and then there were casseroles. Denise, my brother Beckett's wife, moved through the rooms, opening curtains and pretending she had always been welcome to open them. She was 30. She wore a green headband instead of her funeral clip. She kissed my cheek at the door with a soft murmur about how I could stay with them for a night or two, and then in the same breath she asked Beckett if he had measured the front room for their sectional. I heard both sentences the same, because I had been listening for both of them for 14 months. Ms. Hensley arrived at 4 o'clock in a tired coat and boots she had wiped at the door. She was a lawyer from the next town over. She had known my grandfather back when he still drove. She set her scuffed leather folder on the kitchen table and read plain sentences while rain ticked at the window over the sink. Beckett received the farmhouse. Judd received an equal share of the farmhouse. Together they received the tractor barn and the field that ran east to County Road 9. Beckett received Emmett's truck. Judd received Emmett's tools. The savings account, what remained after the funeral expenses and the final medical bills, would be divided evenly among the three of us, which Ms. Hensley said in the careful voice of a woman who had already seen the balance and knew there would not be much. Then she came to me, Sadie Whittaker, the cabin at the end of Bell Orchard Lane, together with the orchard on the western slope, 9¾ acres, recorded separately in the county register since 1975. She named the acreage. I heard the number, but I could not hold on to it. I was looking at the pale ring on the wooden table where Grandpa's coffee mug had sat every morning since the year Grandma Marigold died. Beckett asked 2 questions about property taxes. Judd asked whether Emmett had left any specific instructions about the tools in the barn. I asked whether he had said why. Ms. Hensley looked down at the page. She looked at me. The will did not include personal explanations. I'm sorry, she added, and she meant it. Beckett shifted in his chair, his funeral suit pulled tight across his shoulders. He was a man who worked at a desk for a company that leased farming equipment. He owned 5 ties. He read financial news on his phone at breakfast. He was not built for a chair in a room where someone had just been told her grandfather had drawn a line around her. Look, Sadie. His voice took on the register he used at work. I was the one who liked the orchard. I had gone out there with him. It made sense. I told him I had liked the farmhouse too. I told him I had been living here. There was the silence I should have expected. Not shock, not sympathy. The practical silence people made when someone mentioned a stain on a ceiling and everyone in the room began calculating the cost of fixing it. You've been staying here, Beckett said finally. His voice was slow and reasonable in the way that reasonable voices are usually only slow for one person at a time. For 14 months, to help Grandpa, which we are grateful for. Nobody is forgetting that. Judd lowered his eyes to the paperwork. I wanted him to look up. Judd had always been the one who noticed when Beckett went too far. As a boy, he used to knock on the wall between our bedrooms after an argument. 3 soft taps, meaning don't listen to him. He could make disapproval feel like loyalty as long as he did not have to say it out loud. He was 27 years old, and he was still holding on to that skill. Beckett opened his hands, palms up, reasonable. Nobody was putting me on the street. I had the cabin. Ms. Hensley capped her pen with a quiet snap. She had heard families read a will before. She knew the sound of a room turning against one person and calling it fairness. She stood. She said she would call if there were questions, and she left. The neighbors began drifting out after her. Casseroles collected. Empty crockpots claimed. A cousin I had not seen since Camille's funeral kissed my forehead and told me I looked strong. I did not know what that meant. Strong for what? Strong to what? By 4:30, the house held only the 3 of us, in the peculiar mess of a life becoming objects. Emmett's suspenders hung from a chair. His hearing aid batteries waited in a cereal bowl by the toaster. A stack of sympathy cards leaned against 3 envelopes from the electric company, all addressed in the rigid block letters of people who had stopped seeing his name years ago. I carried my duffel from the back bedroom to the kitchen. My whole life for 14 months fit into that bag, which was not true either because my winter coat still hung in the hall closet, and my work shoes were still by the back door, and my blue ceramic mug from the community college cafeteria sat in the dish drainer where I had left it that morning. I had been enrolled at the community college in the town over, 2 credits away from finishing my second year of general studies. I had withdrawn on the 3rd day of November of the year before last. On a Friday afternoon, on the phone, from the parking lot of the hospital where they were still deciding whether Emmett's stroke had been the small kind or the bigger one. I had told the registrar it was temporary. The registrar had said what registrars say, which is that a person could always reapply. I never reapplied. Beckett came in carrying a cardboard box marked Denise Christmas in Sharpie. He said we needed to change the locks before the contractors started coming through. I looked at him, not angry yet, just uncomprehending. Contractors for what? The upstairs bathroom, he told me. There was damage under the tub. I said Grandpa had said it could wait. Grandpa put a roasting pan under a leak and called it plumbing. Despite myself, I almost smiled. Emmett had called it preventative architecture. Judd caught the smile too, and Beckett saw both of us and looked irritated, as if we had become children at exactly the wrong moment. Denise and he had been talking, he told the ceiling. They might use the place on weekends at first, fix it up right. Judd said nothing, which was Judd's whole language. I asked where I was supposed to sleep tonight. Beckett's eyes went past the kitchen window, past the tractor shed, past the black shape of the cabin down the slope, small against the winter trees. That was how I learned that gratitude had an expiration time. Hein gave me an envelope. I opened it standing there in the kitchen where I had made his grandfather biscuits 2 mornings before he stopped eating. Inside the envelope was a brass key and a white metal plate, rectangular, rusted at the 4 screw holes in the corners, black raised numbers, 118 Bell Orchard Lane. I turned it over in my palm. The cabin had an address, I said. Apparently it had a separate address. Beckett said it flat, as if he had rehearsed the flatness. Since when? I didn't know. Grandma probably put it up when she was selling stuff out there. Grandpa never used it. Selling what? Beckett looked at Judd. Judd shrugged and offered apples, jelly, that kind of thing when we were little. I did not remember. I had been 7 when Marigold died. She existed for me in scraps that might have belonged to photographs and might have belonged to me. A red bandana over silver hair, cool fingers testing my forehead, the smell of cinnamon and something sharper. Vinegar, maybe. She had been Grandpa's wife, a woman praised for feeding people and surviving his moods. Beckett tucked Emmett's house key onto his own ring. It made a small, expensive click. The cabin had been closed up, he told me. I ought to air it out. He would give it an hour before dark. I did not miss the tense or the timing. You're changing the locks tonight, I said. He said before dark. On a house I've been living in for 14 months. He looked at me the way he had looked at me since I was 12, and I had asked to hold his high school baseball trophy. Which was to say, not quite, not directly, as if the space between us needed a small adjustment. Nobody was putting me on the street. I had a cabin. I had my own address. Denise was standing in the doorway now. She had heard the last part. Her hands were doing something with a dish towel that did not need doing. Sadie, honey, she began. She used the 2 words the way people use them when they have not decided which one to trust. She said something about how they would never. She said something about how, if I needed a night. She said something about the downstairs office and the pull-out and how it would be temporary. Just temporary. Because the office downstairs, just maybe. I put the address plate back in the envelope. I picked up my blue mug from the dish drainer. I picked up my duffel. I took my winter coat from the hall closet. I put my feet into the muddy funeral shoes at the back door. Judd said my name once, quiet, like a knock on a wall. I walked past him. The rain had thinned to a mist by the time I crossed behind the barn. Emmett's tractor sat under its lean-to with a spray of funeral mud dried along the rear tire. The whole slope smelled of wet cedar and the cold iron scent of tools and the deep sour undernote of a farm that had stopped being farmed. Beyond the tractor, the orchard spread down the western hillside in uneven rows. At a distance, the trees looked dead. Up close, their black branches held tight reddish buds. He had shown me the difference in February the year before Camille died. Dead wood snapped, living wood bent. I followed the rutted lane. The duffel bumped against my leg. The address plate was in my coat pocket. The blue mug I carried by its handle because I did not trust myself not to set it down and lose it if I put it in the bag. Judd caught up near the first row of pear trees. He was carrying the cardboard box Denise had set on Emmett's chair. He had taken sheets from the linen closet, a flashlight, two of Grandpa's old wool blankets, and the little electric kettle from the pantry. I told him that was Grandpa's kettle, that Grandpa had left it to the house. Technically, he agreed. And then after a beat that was too long for a joke and too short for an apology, he said he had stolen from himself. He had filed the paperwork. He was not a funny man, but he had timing, which was almost the same thing. The cabin emerged from behind a line of overgrown cedar, smaller than I remembered. Its porch sagged at the left corner. Green moss climbed the steps. One shutter hung by a single hinge. Above the door, four rusted screw holes marked the place where something rectangular had once been mounted. I stopped in the wet grass. I took the address plate out of my pocket. I held it up to the faded cedar above the door. The holes matched. They matched exactly. Judd shifted the box on his hip. "Huh," was all he said, which was the closest he came to saying "I know." He got the lock working with the brass key on the third try. The bolt turned with a sound like a cough. Cold, stale air rolled out and moved past us into the yard. Judd swung the flashlight beam. It found a wood stove, a narrow iron bed frame with a stained bare mattress rolled up on it, a pine table buried under coils of twine and old picking bags. Mouse droppings speckled the counters. A brown water stain spread across the ceiling directly above the bed frame. Judd stood in the doorway. I watched his jaw move once. "I could not sleep here," he told me. That was what he chose to lead with. I told him Beckett thought I could. Beckett did not know what it looked like. He knew enough to change the locks. He set the box down on the pine table, very carefully, because there was so much dust that setting it down anywhere else would have raised a cloud. He offered me his couch. It folded if you kicked it. Home for Judd was a one-bedroom apartment above an insurance office in town. He owned two plates and a couch that had never fully forgiven him. The offer was sincere, which almost made it worse. I set the blue mug down on the dusty table. I told him I was tired of staying in places where somebody else could decide when I was done. Judd's face changed, not into anger, not into pity, into a look I had seen once when he was 14 and I was 7, and Grandma Marigold's dog had died in the yard, and he could not carry her by himself and would not ask for help. Before he could answer, rainwater struck the metal sink with a bright solitary ping, then another. I looked up at the spreading stain. Judd cleared his throat and offered in the smallest voice he had that he had brought a bucket too. I laughed. I did not mean to. The sound came out bent in the middle and Judd laughed with me. Both of us standing in a freezing cabin on the day we buried our grandfather. Two Whitakers on a piece of land that had our name on it, in a place we had not been given permission to be. When the laughter stopped, he set the bucket beneath the leak. He said he would come back in the morning, with tools, with coffee. He was already halfway to the door when he turned in the frame and hesitated, the way he had hesitated when he was 14 with a dead dog he could not carry. "Sadie," he said one time. "Not tonight, Judd." That was all I gave him. He went. I watched the shape of him move through the orchard until the gray swallowed it. Far uphill, the farmhouse lamps came on inside one by one. The kitchen, the hall, the upstairs bathroom Beckett wanted to rip out. My grandfather's bedroom, where he had died 59 hours ago. I shut the cabin door. In the flashlight beam, the white address plate waited on the table beside my blue mug and my duffel and Emmett's old kettle. I picked the plate up. I fitted against the four old screw holes above the door. Somebody had taken it down, then somebody else had saved it, which meant Emmett had saved it, which meant that Emmett had known this rectangle of tin still had a purpose, and that he had not told me. I stood there with the plate held to the wood until my arms shook. Then I laid it on the table and I sat on the edge of the rolled mattress with my hands in my lap, and I did what I had not let myself do at the cemetery, which was not exactly crying. Not exactly, it was something quieter than that. It was the sound a person makes when they finally set down a thing they have been carrying for 14 months and cannot immediately remember what their hands were for before. The cabin had electricity in the archaeological sense. Cloth-wrapped wire ran along the rafters. A ceramic light switch clicked up and down under my thumb with crisp authority. It produced nothing. When I turned the sink faucet, the pipe shuddered inside the wall and gave me 3 drops of orange water, the color of dry blood. Then it gave nothing. I spread Judge sheets over the mattress without looking too closely at what they covered. The water stain above the frame had already begun dripping faster. I dragged the mattress onto the floor near the wood stove and arranged 2 saucepans beside the bucket. Emmett's old wool coat hung from a peg beside the door. I had brought my own coat, but I was already so cold my fingers were slow. I put his on over mine. It smelled of cedar chips and damp dust, and the faint mineral bite of the salve I had rubbed into his shoulders the night before he stopped breathing. I remembered that salve. I remembered his shoulders. I remembered 14 months of the small daily grammar of caring for a body that would not let go and would not be still. Turning him at 3 in the morning, cutting his food into pieces that were smaller than his mouth thought they should be, reading him the sports page, reading him letters from the Farm Bureau newsletter, reading him one Thursday afternoon in October the entire label of a bottle of shampoo because he had asked what it said and I had not had the heart to say no. He had held my hand the whole time. He had not remembered my name that Thursday. He had remembered my hand. My phone showed 11% battery. 2 missed calls from Denise. The first voicemail was gentle. She said Beckett had told her there was some confusion. She said they would never expect me to solve everything tonight. She said I could put my things in the barn until I figured out my next step. The second voicemail arrived 9 minutes later. Denise wanted to know where Grandpa kept the upstairs bathroom towels. Not the brown ones, the decent blue set. I deleted both messages. I tried to light the wood stove. The damper was frozen. Smoke curled out around the door. Emmett had stopped using it after a chimney fire scorched the roof 6 years ago. I remembered Beckett shouting at him for climbing the ladder to fix it. I remembered Emmett shouting back that 72 was not a diagnosis. I let the fire die rather than becoming the second Whitaker to prove a point with carbon monoxide. I checked my banking app before it drained the battery. $52.17. I had $11 in cash in my coat pocket. I sat on the mattress on the floor with Emmett's coat over Judd's stolen sheets, and I did the math. The math did not work. It did not work if I ate. It did not work if I did not eat. It did not work if I bought gas. It did not work if I did not buy gas because I had to get to work at whatever job I could find tomorrow morning. Because there had to be a job tomorrow morning. Because there was no other math. Somewhere in the wall behind me a mouse scratched, slow and unhurried, as if it had been waiting to see whether I planned to stay. If it was bigger than a squirrel, I told the dark we would need to discuss rent. The scratching stopped. My laughter did not come this time. By 1 in the morning, my phone had died. By 3, every root in my mouth ached from the cold. Rain tapped the metal sink in one spot, then paused, then resumed in another as if the roof were thinking through the problem. I did not sleep, not really, which was fine, because sleep was not the point that night. The point that night was that a woman I had barely known, who had been dead since I was 7, had taken the time to have a piece of enamel made with numbers on it, which meant she had wanted her work to have a name. And now the numbers were in my coat pocket, which meant she had wanted the name to reach me. I did not know that yet, not the whole of it. But I felt the edge of it, the way you feel a hand under the water before you feel who it belongs to. I woke at dawn to a knock and the smell of coffee. Judd pushed the door open with his shoulder before I could get up. He carried 2 paper cups in a cardboard tray, a red toolbox, and a grocery bag looped around his wrist that dripped condensation onto the boards. His hair was flat on one side. He had not been to bed either. He looked at me a long moment before he spoke. Then he told me I looked terrible. I told him Grandpa had looked terrible at his funeral and nobody had mentioned it. He said quiet that he had mentioned it privately. He crouched by the wall and opened the toolbox. He was a man who repaired commercial refrigerators for a company in the next town over. He treated household wiring with the wary respect of a man who understood exactly how much he did not know. He had brought a drill, screws, an outlet tester, 2 extension cords, and oatmeal. He could not remember he explained whether I liked the eggs at that place. I told him I hated their eggs. He nodded. He had gotten oatmeal. I hated oatmeal. He accepted this with the calm of a man who had been raised by our grandfather. My other choice he offered was dying. He handed me the paper cup. The coffee was too hot and too strong, and it was the closest thing to a hand on my shoulder I had felt in 14 months. Beckett had called him last night, Judd said after a while. He was looking at the dead outlet, not at me. I told him Beckett did not call. Denise did. Beckett listened. I asked what Denise had said. Judd shrugged in Emmett's coat, which he had somehow put back on before he came down. I answered for him. She offered me the barn. He did not correct me, which was answer enough. He unscrewed the outlet cover. Behind it, the wires looked brittle enough to crumble if I looked at them too hard. We needed an electrician, he said half to himself. We needed money. I was getting some. From the estate. Eventually. Hensley had said bills came out first. There would not be much. He sat back on his heels. He could cover it, he told me. It was power, not a hot tub. No. He looked up at me from the floor. His hair was still flat on one side. He was so much like our grandfather in that moment I had to look at the ceiling until it went away. We could run a cord from the barn, he offered quieter. Until I could afford it. Across the lane. Across the lane. Beckett would love that. Beckett owned half a barn. Judd owned the other half. He said it like the geometry of a fair deal. He said it in the same voice Emmett had once used standing on the same porch telling me that a bird should be able to fly through a properly pruned apple tree. I looked at my brother and I did what I had refused to let myself do the night before with the address plate against the wood. I told him thank you. Twice. And I meant it both times. He waved me off like I had passed him the salt. We ran the extension cord along the edge of the lane, threading it beneath the wet grass where tires would not cross. Judd plugged it into the barn's exterior outlet, which was still live because Beckett had not yet gotten around to changing anything but a lock. The orange line carried a thin, improbable current down the hill. Inside the cabin, I filled Emmett's kettle from a gallon jug of drinking water I had bought from the gas station 2 months ago and forgotten in the trunk of my mother's old car. When I pressed the switch on the kettle, its little red light came on. Neither of us spoke. The cabin was still cold. The roof still leaked. The pipe still held rust. The mouse in the wall was still assessing my rent history. But the kettle began its low electric murmur, and I felt the room change around that ordinary sound. Judd stood by the pantry with his coffee. He looked at the wall behind the crate we had shoved aside to get to the outlet. He tilted his head. He said my name. He asked me to come look. I set the mug down. I walked over. He lifted the flashlight and pointed the beam at the pantry wall. Behind the crate on the plaster in pencil, someone had written a list. Dates, names of apple varieties, numbers in bushels, small circled totals in the margin of some years. Whole years of writing in a rounder, smaller hand. The hand of a woman I had barely known. The hand of Marigold, my grandmother, who had been dead since I was 7. I stepped closer. I put my thumb against the wall next to the pencil marks. I did not touch them. The room narrowed to the size of the light beam. Because on the bottom half of the wall below, Marigold's rounded letters, someone had added new entries, in darker blunt strokes, in a hand that tilted forward, in a hand that pressed too hard on the pencil the way people press too hard when their fingers do not want to obey them anymore. Stamen, North Row, still good. I knew that writing. I had watched that hand label every jar of screws in the barn. I had watched it write beef soup too salty across a freezer bag one January. I had watched it sign my name into the emergency contact line of a pharmacy form he could no longer read on his own. Emmett had written on this wall. I turned to Judd. His mouth was open a little. When I asked him, he did not know. The pencil was over the grease stain on the plaster. I said it out loud so he could see me thinking. He had not come down here last year. He could not get down the stairs by August. He could not have gotten down here. He got down here somehow, Sadie. Judd said it quiet. I looked at the numbers on the wall. My eyes tracked down the list to the last dark entry, the date beside it, written in Emmett's tilted hand. 9/17/23. The date meant something to me before I could name what it was. 17th of September, 2 months before he had his stroke. 6 months before I bought a bottle of the ointment I had rubbed into his shoulders the night he died. He had not told me he was coming down here. He had not told me he could walk this far. He had told me he could barely get to the porch of the farmhouse, which meant he had lied, which meant he had come down here alone, on purpose, for a reason he had not shared, in a body that had almost failed him, to write on a wall behind a crate, where no one would find it, unless somebody moved the crate, unless somebody was in this cabin with an outlet cover open and a flashlight in her brother's hand. Judd read the date over my shoulder. He did not say anything, because that was Judd, because when a thing was too big for a sentence, Judd knew better than to swing at it. I put my hand on the plaster next to the numbers. I did not press. The pencil did not smudge, because pencil did not smudge if it had been there long enough, which it had. 16 months-ish. He had come down here 16 months ago, and he had written on this wall, and he had gone back up to the farmhouse, and he had not said a word. Not to me, not to Judd, not to anyone. He had been planning something. For me. The kettle clicked off behind us. The little red light went out. Judd cleared his throat. He came down here for me. I finished the sentence he had not started. I don't know that yet, I heard myself add, though I did. Sadie. I looked at him. His face was the face of the 14-year-old boy who had not been able to lift the dog. It was the face of the 17-year-old who had knocked 3 times on our shared wall the night our mother had grounded me for something I did not do. It was the face of the 27-year-old man who had stood in Emmett's coat at a graveside and not cried where anyone could see him. He came down here for you, Judd said. You know that. I did not answer, because I could not. Because if I opened my mouth to answer him, everything I had swallowed in the last 14 months would come up out of me in the shape of a single question, which was, what did you know? What did you know about her? About the woman with the red bandana over silver hair, whose fingers had tested my forehead in a bedroom I did not remember in a house I now owned by way of pencil on a wall? What did you know about the address that had a plate? What did you know about a business she had run out of a cabin the men in our family had told me was a shed? What did you know that Emmett had gone downhill in a body that could not hold itself up, in September, alone, to write on a wall, for me? I did not open my mouth. I held it closed the way I had held it closed at the cemetery, the way I had held it closed when Beckett said you have the cabin, the way I had held it closed for 14 months standing at the sink of a house I had cleaned and cooked in and slept in and lost sleep in while my brother measured the front room for a sectional. I held it closed until Judd nodded. Slow. The way a man nods when he has just been told the size of a thing he cannot fix by himself. He put a hand on my shoulder, very briefly. It weighed almost nothing. And then it weighed everything. We would figure it out, was all he said. He picked up his coffee. He picked up the toolbox. He went outside to check the extension cord. I stayed at the pantry. I stayed at the pencil marks. I read them slowly. Marigold's writing at the top. Years, varieties, winesap, Grimes, golden, stamen, quince. A tree she had insisted was not an apple. Bushel counts. A total for 1988 circled twice. A note in her hand beside one row that said, Loretta H6 on Sunday. I did not know a Loretta. Not yet. Below her writing, Emmett's dark, forward-tilting entries, written the September before he had his stroke. in a hand that had once labeled a spice jar and had by then almost stopped being able to sign a check. Stamen, North Row, still good. Below that in smaller letters so faint I had to bring the flashlight in closer. Sadie, she'll find it. I stopped breathing. Beyond the cabin window, the wet orchard held itself in the gray light of a January morning. The trees looked dead. They were not. The pencil marks on the wall in front of me had been made by a man who could barely walk. On a day I had not known about. About a girl he had never once in 14 months of dying said aloud that he was worried about. Which is another way of saying he had loved me in a language I had not learned yet. Which is another way of saying that at the end of my grandfather's life, when I had been sitting beside him wringing out cool washcloths and reading him the sports page in a voice that pretended not to know, he could not follow it anymore. He had been leaving a message for me in a cabin I would only enter after he was gone. Which is another way of saying that, on the morning after his funeral, in a freezing back room of a place my family called worthless, on a wall behind a crate that had not been moved in 20 years, my grandfather Emmett Whitaker had written my name. She'll find it. She, meaning me. It, meaning what? The kettle, the mouse, the cord, the orange extension line running down through wet grass under a lane my brother had already decided was inconvenient. The mattress on the floor, the bucket, the blue mug on the table, the address plate, the brass key, the 118 numbers of a place I had inherited from a woman I could barely remember. It. The word did not narrow. It got wider the longer I stood at the wall. Because if Emmett had written she'll find it, then there was more. He had not written that sentence about a wall. He had written it because there was something else, somewhere else, in this cabin, or under it, or in it, or attached to it in some way I had not yet been able to see, because I had spent my first night here shivering under a leaking roof and doing math I could not make work. I put my forehead against the plaster next to the pencil. It was so cold it felt clean. I stood there for a long moment. Judd's boots came back onto the porch. He knocked lightly on the frame before he came in. That was Judd, even in a cabin that was mine, even with an outlet cover already off. He knocked. He was carrying something, not a tool. He had found it in the barn last week, he told me. It was Grandma's. He held out a small, warped wooden crate. Faded blue letters showed through the grime along the side. He set it on the pantry counter next to the mug. He did not open it. Grandpa had wanted me to have it, he added. Who told him that? Grandpa. In August, before the stroke. The room did what rooms do when you have been standing in one place too long. It reoriented itself around a fixed point. The fixed point was my brother's face, which was not looking at the wall, which was not looking at me, which was looking down at the crate, which he had known was in the barn, which he had known was for me, which he had not told me about for 5 months. I did not ask him why, because I could see the answer standing in the doorway behind him in a coat Beckett had bought new for the funeral, which I could see through the pantry window. Beckett stood at the top of the lane, watching the cabin, his hand raised, not waving, just up. Judd saw my face. He turned. He saw Beckett, too. Beckett lowered his hand slowly. He stood there for a long count of 5. Then he turned. He walked back up the hill to the farmhouse. He did not come down. The cabin held the sound of the kettle cooling, and the drip in the bucket, and the two of us breathing. I looked at the crate on the counter. I looked at the pencil on the wall. I looked at the address plate on the table. I looked at my brother who had been keeping something for me for 5 months. I did not open the crate, not yet, because whatever was in it and whatever the pencil marks meant, and whatever it was that Emmett had left in a place I did not yet know how to look for, one thing had already become very clear to me on that January morning in the coldest room I had ever slept in. My grandfather had built a road for me. He had built it while he was dying. And my oldest brother, standing on the lane in a new coat watching me through the wet trees, had known there was a road, and had said nothing. Judd went outside to give me the space to look at the crate alone. He did not say that was what he was doing. He just went. I heard his boots on the porch steps, and then the soft rip of the tarp on the roof he had brought, and did not yet have a ladder for. I did not open the crate. I put my hand on the lid. I closed my eyes. I said her name out loud for the first time in 13 years. Grandma Marigold. The cabin did not answer. Cabins do not answer. But somewhere below the floorboards or above the rafters or in the wood grain of the pantry itself, something settled. Not toward me. Toward the sound of a name that had not been spoken in this room in a long time. I put my forehead down on the crate. I did not cry. I said one more thing, very quiet, because I meant it. Show me where to look. Outside, the wet January light shifted. A single break in the cloud. It moved across the orchard slope from north to south. It touched the 4 rusted screw holes above the cabin door where the address plate had once hung. It touched the extension cord snaking down the lane. It touched the frozen upper branches of a stamen tree in the north row that my grandfather had written about on a wall in September with a hand that could barely hold a pencil. Then it moved on. The gray came back. But I had seen where it went, and so had he. The crate sat on the pantry counter for 2 full days before I opened it. Not because I was afraid of it, which was a lie. I was afraid of it. Because a crate my grandfather had marked for me and had asked my middle brother to keep for 5 months and had never once mentioned to me while he was still alive, was not the sort of crate you opened between shifts, between chores, between the small dying acts of running an extension cord back to a barn my oldest brother had begun to resent letting me borrow. I opened it on Thursday morning, before dawn, before the diner, before anyone in the county was awake enough to knock on my door with an opinion about it. Inside were 3 things: a picking bag, canvas, faded to almost no color at all, the strap repaired with black thread, Marigold's initials stitched inside the flap in a hand that had not learned to sew from a book, a tin of straight pins, rusted at the edges, 3 loose apple seeds rattling in the bottom, and a photograph, small, black and white. A woman with pale hair and a check shirt stood in front of the cabin. She wore trousers, no apron. Her hands rested on a crate of apples on the step. Above her head, the address plate was mounted straight and clean. And beside her, standing so close their shoulders touched, was a second woman. Young, very young, 16 at the outside, dark hair pulled back, both hands cupped low across her stomach. 7 months into a shape a woman that age does not usually put in a photograph. I sat on the edge of the mattress with the picture in my lap, and I looked at the 2 women for a long time, because I did not know the second one. But I knew the first one. In the way you know a face you have been given in scraps. A red bandana over silver hair. Cool fingers on your forehead. The smell of cinnamon and something sharper. I knew Marigold Whitaker, and I did not know the girl next to her, which meant somebody in my family had done a lot of not mentioning. I went to work. I did not tell Judd about the picture. I did not tell anyone. Bellwether Diner opened at 5. Phyllis unlocked the door at 4:58 and looked at the clock over the pie case. I was late. It was 4:58, I told her. Then I had time to be early. By 6, the front of house was full. Muddy work boots, insulated jackets, a line of men who had opinions about which pot the freshest coffee came from. A woman named Jo, who drove a feed truck, took the last piece of pecan pie with her second cup and asked me if I was the Whitaker girl from up on the ridge. I said yes. My grandfather had cheated her in a dominoes game in 1994, she informed me, and she had never forgotten. Then she left me a $5 tip on a $6 breakfast. Curtis wanted 3 ice cubes in his orange juice. Not 4, never 4. By 8:30, I had learned that the freezer door required a hip check to close, that the fluorescent bulb over table 6 was buzzing loud enough to make one of the regulars ask if we could just shoot it. That grief did not excuse mistakes, but it made customers strangely specific in their complaints, as if the whole diner had agreed without saying so to speak to me only about the eggs. At 9, a man came in. Tall, dark work shirt, grease at one shoulder, brown hair too long at the collar, a pale scar cutting through his left eyebrow that made his face look mildly amused when it was not moving. He sat at the far end of the counter. He ordered coffee, black, and eggs over easy. He did not look up when he said it, but he looked up when I brought the plate. He looked at me. He looked at the plate. He looked at me again. The plate was oatmeal. He had not ordered oatmeal, he mentioned quiet. I told him I had heard him the first time. He nearly smiled. His left eyebrow with the scar made the smile look mostly ironic. His right eyebrow without the scar made it look mostly patient. The two eyebrows disagreed, and in the disagreement, I recognized him. Not the whole face. The shape of the boy who had been 3 grades ahead of me at the county high school. The one who used to lift the projector into the storage cabinet at the end of the year because nobody else could reach the shelf. Ansel Corbin, Sadie Whitaker. He had broken his arm falling off the water tower. He shook his head. That was Beckett. I remembered. Beckett had jumped. There had been a mattress at the bottom. Allegedly. Ansel granted me the smallest correction. There had been a mattress after Beckett hit the ground. Phyllis slid an order ticket beneath my hand at exactly the moment I laughed. She did not look up from the register. Conversation was for people who could carry it in 3 plates. I was not those people yet, sweetheart. I moved. I corrected his oatmeal to eggs on my way past the pass-through. When I came back with the corrected plate, he had left a business card on the counter under his coffee cup. Corbin Equipment Repair, local number. On the back in a squared handwriting I already trusted more than I wanted to, he had written a warning. Judd had shown him a photo of the sprayer. Not to start that machine until someone checked the tank. I read it twice. I told him I had not been going to start it. He finished his coffee unhurried. It did not have an engine. I knew that. It was a hand pump. I knew that. His look was patient, the way patient people are patient when they have already decided the outcome. He had assumed I had been going to look for a cord. I set his eggs down harder than the eggs deserved. I told Phyllis at the end of my shift that I had a friend who might come look at my grandfather's old sprayer. Phyllis did not look up from wiping down the counter. Ansel Corbin was not my friend. He wasn't. I was, however, a decent mechanic, she said, which was more useful than a friend at my income level. She told me to take the free labor, not to fall in love with it. Nobody had said anything about love. Sweetheart, she said. She said the word the way she said fresh pie, which was to say she said it without needing to say the rest of it. Odette Marchand knocked on the cabin door on Thursday afternoon. She was 62. She had come up the lane in a pickup so old the paint had gone from red to a color that had no name. She wore a canvas coat. She carried a walking stick she did not appear to need. And she carried a thermos of coffee in a paper bag with 2 ham biscuits in a small manila envelope that she did not put down. She did not introduce herself the way people usually did. She looked at the address plate over the door, which Judd and I had rehung the night before using 2 screws that did not match and 1 strip of copper wire, because it turned out none of the 4 old screws would fit the 4 old holes. Crooked was her greeting. I told her so was the owner. Marigold would have fixed it. I stopped with my hand on the door, because that was the first time in 13 years anyone had said my grandmother's name to me without their voice going soft first. Odette stepped up onto the porch without asking. She set the thermos on the porch rail. She set the biscuits beside it. She kept the envelope in her hand. She looked at me the way a woman looks at another woman she has been waiting to see for a very long time. She confirmed my name. Sadie Whitaker. I had my mother's shoulder, she told me. So people had said I offered. Not enough people. I did not answer. She looked past me into the cabin. She looked at the pencil marks on the pantry wall behind the glass panel Judd had mounted the day before. She looked at the picking bag hanging on the peg beside the door. She looked at the address plate above her head. She asked if she could sit. I said yes. We sat on the porch, on 2 mismatched chairs Judd had dragged out of the shed. The chairs had once been painted green. They were mostly now the color of the trees. Odette poured coffee for both of us without asking. She used 2 paper cups from her coat pocket. She screwed the thermos closed with a careful twist. She was a woman who did nothing sloppily. Her first real question when it came was how much my family had told me about my grandmother. Almost nothing, I admitted. So she had thought. She reached into her coat and brought out the envelope. She did not hand it to me right away. She held it flat between her hands on her knees, as if it needed her permission before it could travel any farther. Before she opened it, she wanted me to know a thing about who she was, because my grandmother had not told it to my grandfather, and my grandfather had not told it to my brothers. And that was because Marigold had asked them both not to, because it was not their story to tell. I set my coffee down, because I had heard enough sentences begin that way in 14 months to know what came next was not a sentence I could sip through. She had come to this cabin in the spring of 1980, she told me. She was 17. She was pregnant. Her father had put her suitcase on the porch of the house she had grown up in and shut the door behind it. The porch was very quiet. Somewhere in the wet orchard a crow called once. It did not call again. Her mother's aunt had worked at a Baptist ladies' auxiliary in the next county over. She had known Marigold. She had written her a letter. Marigold had driven to the church on a Wednesday. She had sat in the pastor's office and she had said, "My cabin is empty in the west orchard. It has a wood stove and a good roof and a sink and it locks from the inside. If a young woman needs a place to have a baby and figure out what comes next, my cabin has a bed." I could not swallow. Odette opened the envelope. She took out one photograph. The same photograph I had found in the crate, the woman with pale hair, the girl with dark hair, the girl with both hands cupped low across her stomach. Odette laid the photograph on the porch rail between our two cups. That was her, at 17, and that was my grandmother, and this was the porch we were sitting on. The world did what the world does when a piece of it has been in the wrong place for 45 years and has just now moved back where it was supposed to be, which is that nothing looks any different, and everything is. I looked at the photograph, I looked at the porch rail, I looked at Odette. I could not make my mouth work, which was fine because she was not finished. She had stayed 4 months, she went on. She had had her daughter in the county hospital. Marigold had driven her. Marigold had sat with her. Marigold had not let anyone at that hospital write anything on her paperwork that was not what she wanted written. And when she had come back here to the cabin with a baby and no idea what came next, Marigold had made her a cup of tea in that kitchen, in that exact kitchen. And she had said to her, she had said, "Odette, my work has just gotten a name because now I know what it's for." I could feel my heart in my collarbones. What had she meant? Odette answered before I finished the question. She had meant the cabin. She had meant the address. I looked at the plate over the door. I looked at the 4 rusted screw holes. I looked at the crooked plate held to old cedar with mismatched screws and one piece of copper wire. How many? Odette turned the photograph over on the rail. On the back in Marigold's rounded handwriting was a list. OM 1980, daughter. Placed with family in Winston. LH 1989, widow, 6 months, left when ready. RK 1991. 15, left with father in Asheville after mediation. CT 1993, beaten. 4 weeks, left with new job in Charlotte. The list continued. Down the back of the photograph, in Marigold's hand, small, rounded, careful, some in ink, some in pencil, all in the same alphabetical patience. 13 sets of initials, 13 years and dates, 13 short single-line notes. My grandmother had saved 13 women in this cabin, Odette said, over the course of 30 years, and my grandfather had known, and my father had not, and my brothers did not, and now I did. I stood up from the chair. I did not mean to. My legs did it. I walked to the porch rail. I put both hands on it. I looked out at the wet orchard, at the tractor path behind the cabin, where a girl with dark hair and a curved belly had walked in 1980 to a hospital and back to a bed in this house, which had never been a shed, which had been, which was. Ansel Corbin came in for breakfast this week, I said. And I did not know why I said that, except that my mouth was moving because my head could not. Odette did not seem confused. His mother, she told me. Carla. Carla had been in my grandmother's ladies' auxiliary group. Carla had used to bring canning jars to Marigold every August. Carla had known about all of it. Carla had never said. The whole valley had known. No Sadie. Odette was gentle. The 4 or 5 women who needed to know had known, and they had kept their mouths shut because that was what Marigold had asked, because that was what her work had required, because when a girl walked up a lane with a suitcase somebody else had put on a porch for her, the last thing she needed was a receipt. The extension cord ran beneath the porch behind us, faint humming. I did not turn around. Why now, I asked her. Why had she come now? Odette folded the photograph gently and put it back in the envelope. She held the envelope out to me. She did not let go until I took it, because I had the address. She stayed until dark. She did not say the whole of it in one afternoon. She said it the way older women say things, slowly, with coffee refills, with detours through unrelated stories. Marigold had never once written down what she did for a living on a tax form. She had never accepted a check. She had made her money selling pears and jelly and apple butter through the front porch of this cabin on Saturdays. And she had used every dollar of that money for the women who came up the lane. Emmett had known. He had disapproved for the first 4 years. He had thought the risk was too great. In 1984, he had come down here in the middle of a February night to shout at Marigold about it. And he had stayed until dawn. And when he had come back up the hill, he had been carrying a broken bed frame from the cabin and a note in his pocket from Marigold that had said in her writing one word: stay. After that, Emmett had never once made her account for the money again. He had not agreed with her, Odette told me. He had agreed with her, which was a different thing. I did not understand the sentence at first. I understood it later. Judd came down at 7. He brought sandwiches. He recognized Odette. She had gone to school with his best friend's mother. They knew each other in the third cousin way of small counties. He sat on the porch step with a ham sandwich and he listened. He did not interrupt. He asked one question at the end. He asked whether Beckett had ever been told any of this. Odette shook her head. Judd nodded. He ate his sandwich. He did not say anything else. Later, when Odette had gone, and the mouse in the wall was scratching politely at the same corner it had been scratching in for a week, Judd stood up from the porch step and told me we should look for the rest of what Grandpa had left. Grandpa had not said there was more. Sadie, Judd reminded me. Grandpa had written, she'll find it. What did she find? There was more. I was right. I hated that he was right, because I had known it for 2 days, and I had not said it out loud because saying it out loud meant getting up in the morning and doing something about it. We started with the pantry wall. We took the crate down. We ran our hands along the plaster. We tapped it with knuckles. Nothing gave. Nothing sounded hollow. We looked at the floor. We lifted the corner of the linoleum. Ordinary subfloor. We looked at the mattress frame. Ordinary iron. Rust. Nothing under it but 40 years of dust and one dead spider whose position suggested he had been dead longer than I had been alive. We went out to the shed behind the cabin. The shed was 10 feet by 12, wood siding, a single window with a broken pane, Emmett's picking poles inside, a 3-legged orchard ladder, a wheeled sprayer with a cracked hose, the dented tank Ansel had told me not to touch, and along the back wall a heavy wooden bench, bolted to the floor. I had seen it a dozen times before. It was a bench in a shed. It held a jar of nails on one end and a coffee tin of screws on the other end and a stack of empty picking bags in the middle. Judd looked at me. I looked at the bench. Neither of us needed to say the obvious thing, which was that the bench was the only object in this shed that had been fixed to the ground. I felt the way a person feels when the road they have been on for 2 days makes a turn they had almost expected. We cleared the bench, the nails, the screws, the bags, the tin cans, a can of paint that had gone solid 20 years ago, a dried-up wasp nest under one edge. We found the bolts, 4 of them, 2 at each end, rusted flat with the heads almost gone. Judd went back up to the barn for a wrench. He came back with three because he was Judd, and he had learned to bring three of anything from our grandfather. The bolts fought him. They fought him for almost an hour. On the fourth bolt, the wrench slipped, and Judd said a word Emmett had never once said in front of the two of us. And I laughed so hard I sat down on the shed floor. Judd looked at me sideways. Then he laughed too. Both of us in a cold shed under a bare bulb Ansel had wired for us the day before. Judd on his knees, me on the floor, laughing about the first curse word my mid-brother had ever said in my hearing. The bolt gave. We lifted the bench. Under the bench in the dirt was a piece of plywood, rectangular, 2 feet by 3 feet, painted over so many times the paint had gone smooth as skin, set flush into the wooden floor of the shed. Judd looked at it, then at me, then at the ceiling, as if the ceiling might have a comment. Our grandfather had never been a subtle man, he observed quietly and mostly to the rafters. We got a claw hammer. We pried up the plywood. Under the plywood was a cedar box. A cedar box small enough to carry with 2 hands set into a hollowed space between the floor joists. Lined with a piece of oilcloth so old it had gone almost transparent along the folds. Closed with a small brass hasp. No lock. Beside the box at an angle that suggested it had been placed there second was a brass key. Same brass as the key Beckett had given me at the farmhouse table. Different key. A tag looped around the handle in Emmett's forward-tilted hand said, First National. I sat back on my heels. I looked at Judd. Judd at Judd. Judd looked at me. Neither of us said anything for what must have been a full minute. Then Judd told me the eggs at that diner really were terrible, which was Judd's way of saying, I love you, Sadie. I took a breath. I opened the box. Inside the box was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, ordinary lined notebook paper, folded 3 times, and a small cassette tape in its plastic case, the label on the case in Emmett's hand that said, For Sadie, when she finds the box. I did not know I was crying until Judd handed me his handkerchief. Emmett had carried a handkerchief his whole life. Judd had started carrying one at the funeral. I read the letter first. Emmett had written it in September of 2023, 2 months before his stroke, in the same forward-tilted pencil hand as the wall, on plain notebook paper, in a voice I had not heard for 2 months when he was still able to talk to me from his hospital bed, and which I had not heard the whole of since he was 68 years old. Girl, that is how the letter began. I have to keep this short because my hand does not do what I tell it to anymore. The cabin is not what I gave you. The cabin is what your grandmother gave you. She wrote her will in 1985. She named you. You had not been born yet. She said she would name a girl if a girl came, and a girl came. And the girl was you. I have held the deed to this cabin in a bank box for 40 years. That is what she asked me to do. She said, hold this. Give it to her when she is 20. You are 20. She was right about you. She said the one who takes care of somebody dying is the one who knows what a house is for. She said that girl will not sell. I hope she was right about that. Beckett came in November of last year. He wanted me to sign the whole property over to him. He said he had it worked out with a man in Asheville. He said it would be simpler. I said no. He would not leave. I tore the paper. 3 days later, I was in the hospital. But before that, I got down here one time. I do not know how I got down here. My legs did it. I wrote on the wall, in case I did not get to say it out loud. Sadie, she'll find it. The box under the bench has the key to number 47 at First National. Deed, ledger, photos, everything your grandmother kept. Do not sell, not for any price. She wrote her will 40 years ago because she knew. She knew who the ones would be. You were the one girl. You were the one. I am sorry I was not brave enough to tell you when I was breathing. The letter ended there. No signature. He had run out of hand. Judd was sitting beside me in the dirt of the shed. He did not say anything. He handed me the second handkerchief he had started carrying since our grandfather died. I did not put the letter down. I read it again. Which is what a person does. When the person who died has left them a road, and the road has just turned, and the second turn is bigger than the first. The cassette we listened to that night. We used Odette's old player. She had left it for me on the porch that afternoon without saying so. She had known. Emmett's voice came out of the speaker slowly, weak, ragged at the edges, the way a voice sounds when the lungs are already tired. He said my name 3 times before he said anything else. Sadie, Sadie, Sadie. If I was listening to this, then Judd had done what he had asked him to, or I had done it myself. Either way. Good. My grandmother had been the finest person he had ever known. He had not always been kind to her, but she had taught him what work was. She had said work was the thing you could put your name on. She had said she wanted her work to have an address. So they had bought her the numbers, in 77, from the county office. And he had bolted them up over the door of the cabin. He had not understood yet, but he had done it, because she had wanted it done. She had spent 30 years using this cabin for women who did not have anywhere else to go. He had not always agreed, but he had never stopped her. Then his voice on the tape did something I could not have expected. Beckett had known about the cabin longer than I had. Emmett told me. He had found the deed in the bank box 6 years ago. He had been helping me sort my safe deposit after your uncle died. He had read the deed. He had read the names. He had read the year. He had said nothing. He had come back 3 months later and asked if I would consider selling the West acreage to a developer he had met. I had said no. He had asked again the next Christmas. I had said no. He had asked in the spring, the summer, and the fall. He had never asked about the deed. He had known. He had known whose name it was in. He had known the cabin belonged to a girl who had not turned 20 yet. He had known. The cassette hissed. Emmett coughed. It went on longer than I wanted it to. I was not asking me to hate my brother, he continued. He was asking me to know what I was looking at. Because when he was gone, Beckett would make his move. He would use the tone he used. He would use words like practical and reasonable and simpler. He would offer me money, do not sell, not for any price, not even a good one. My grandmother had not saved 13 women in this cabin so a boutique hotel could put a hot tub where the pantry wall was. He loved me, girl. He loved me like my mother did. He would have written this down if his hand had still worked. The tape hissed. The tape ended. Judd and I sat on the mattress in the cabin with the cassette player between us, and neither of us moved for a very long time. The wood stove had gone out. The bucket under the leak had not filled since the morning because it had stopped raining. Somewhere in the wall, the mouse scratched. Judd's voice when he found it was one I had never heard him use. So he had known was all he said. I said it back to him. So he had known. So Beckett had known. So Beckett had known. So Beckett had been. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to, because both of us were putting the last 14 months into a new order. Because in that new order, Beckett's cardboard box marked Denise Christmas in the change lock, in the folded arms in the kitchen, and the phrase "you like the orchard, right?" were not the actions of a brother trying to make a hard day easier. They were the actions of a man who had been running out of time on a plan he had already sold on paper. I called First National at 9 the next morning. The woman on the phone was patient. She was in her 50s. She had known my grandfather. She told me to come on down, bring the key, bring my ID, bring my birth certificate if I had it. They would take care of it. I drove to Ashboro in my mother's car with Judd in the passenger seat. I opened box number 47 at 11 o'clock on Friday morning. Inside the box, in the careful sequence of a woman who had ordered her whole life, were the following things. The original deed to the cabin in the West Orchard, recorded July 7, 1975, in the name of Marigold Louise Whitaker. A will notarized dated May of 1985, naming a granddaughter unnamed as of yet as sole beneficiary of the cabin and the orchard on the western slope. A ledger, leather-bound, 263 pages, names, dates, amounts, customers going back to 1976. Some names crossed out with the word deceased. Some names updated in a second-hand my grandfather's with new addresses. a yellow tab on page 41, a blue tab on page 108, a red tab on the last written page dated November of 2022, a stack of photographs, held with a rubber band, 13 photographs. Every one of them a young woman on the porch of the cabin, some pregnant, some not, some carrying black eyes, some carrying children, all of them in each picture standing very close to Marigold, because closeness was the point of the picture. That was what the picture was for. On the back of each photograph in Marigold's rounded hand initials in a year, OM 1980, LH 1982, RK 1921, CT 1923, MO 1926, JP 1927, DS 1922, TB 2001, AR 2003, KW 2004, EC 2006, MH 2008, SL 2010, 13 photographs, 13 sets of initials, 13 years. The last one dated 2 years before Marigold died. I stood in the private room at the bank with the box open in front of me, and I put my hand flat on top of the stack of photographs, and I looked at Judd across the little table. Judd whispered my name. He did not finish. There was another envelope, I told him. There was, tucked behind the ledger, flat against the back wall of the box. Manila, sealed, written on the front in Emmett's tilted hand. If you get here and Beckett has already talked to a man named Halston, open this. I opened it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The top sheet was a photocopy of a memorandum of understanding, dated 4 months ago, between Beckett D. Whitaker, holding a durable power of attorney for Emmett Ray Whitaker and Halston Development Group, LLC, for the sale of the entire property, farmhouse, barn, field, cabin, orchard, all of it, as a whole, contingent upon consolidation of title, which meant Beckett could not close the deal without the cabin, which meant Beckett could not close the deal without my signature, which meant Beckett had a deadline, which was written at the bottom of the second sheet. In bold in the way lawyers bold things they want to see enforced. 90 days from date of execution, which had been 4 months ago, which meant the deadline had already passed. Except, I turned to the third sheet, which was an amendment, extending the deadline by 30 days, signed 1 week after Emmett died, signed by Beckett, on behalf of Emmett, who had been in a coffin at the time. The name of the woman who had notarized the amendment was printed at the bottom. Ms. Hensley. Judd made a small sound. Not a word. Something under a word. I put the papers back in the manila envelope. I placed the envelope back in the box. I closed the box. I looked at my brother across the table. I needed to go home, I told him. I said it the way a woman says it when she has just figured out where home was the whole time. Denise came down the lane that Saturday afternoon, alone, on foot, in old sneakers, not the green headband. Her hair pinned back with a barrette I recognized from Camille's dresser 30 years ago. She stopped at the edge of the porch. She did not come up onto it. She called my name, soft. I greeted her back. She had heard him on the phone last night. She knew about the amendment. I did not answer because I did not know what to say to a woman who had brought a green headband to my grandfather's funeral and who had been sleeping next to a man who had signed my grandfather's name after my grandfather was dead. Denise put her hands in her coat pockets. She looked at the address plate above my head. She did not look at me. Halston wanted an answer inside 30 days, she told the porch railing. Beckett needed my signature. He was going to ask. He was going to make it look like he was being generous. He was going to offer me a number that would make it feel like the reasonable thing. Because he was scared. Because if I said no, he was stuck. He had signed with them personally. He had guaranteed the deal. I looked at Denise for a long moment. Because a woman does not walk down a rutted January lane in old sneakers to tell her sister-in-law that her husband is trapped. She walks down the lane because she is standing on the wrong side of something, and she wants a witness to notice her moving. Why was she telling me? Because he had not asked her either. She said it the way a person says a thing they have been rehearsing for 2 nights and cannot decide how to feel about yet. She turned to go. She stopped halfway down the porch steps. She did not turn around when she added for what it was worth that she had liked my grandmother. She had only met her once. But Marigold had given her a jar of pear butter at the church picnic in '96, and she had never forgotten. She walked back up the hill. The cold came in on Wednesday. The forecast said 28 degrees for 6 hours, starting at midnight. All through the orchard, the earliest of the fruit blossoms had begun opening. Hundreds of pale mouths turned toward the dark. Ansel came without being asked. He had a truck bed full of tarps and orchard staples and 2 portable propane heaters he had borrowed from a customer. Odette came with 3 thermoses and a canvas coat and a folding chair. Judd came with a heavy gauge extension cord and every sheet from the linen closet at the farmhouse, which he had taken, which he had not asked to take. We covered what we could. We watered the ground beneath the smallest trees. We ran hoses from the barn spigot. We tied sheets around the low limbs of the seckel pear and the young stamen in the Arkansas black that Emmett had planted with me in the spring of the year. My mother died when I was 15 and could not stop shaking, and he had put a shovel in my hand. At 2 in the morning, the thermometer read 28. At 3, it read 27. At 4, it read 28 again. At 5, the sun rose. We took the sheets off. The upper blossoms of the older trees had blackened at the centers. The lower ones under the covers had held. It was not a total loss. It was not a whole crop either. Carla Corbin came at 6. Ansel's mother. She was 69. She had the same patient eyes as her son and none of his restraint. She walked the orchard rows with a paring knife. She cut into blossoms. She held the centers up to the morning light. Half, she pronounced. I asked if that was bad. Carla did not soften it. Girl, in this county, in my grandmother's orchard. Half was the answer. Half had always been the answer. She stayed and drank coffee on my porch until 7. She did not say Marigold's name, but once as she was leaving, she squeezed my elbow and told me my grandmother would have covered exactly what we had covered, in the exact order. She had watched her do it in '79. I could not answer her. I did not have to. At 6:45 that same morning before Carla left, before I had time to be tired, before Ansel had finished coiling the hoses, a truck came down the lane. White, boxy, Tile Express in blue letters across the side. The driver did not slow at the farmhouse. He did not turn at the field. He came straight down Bell Orchard Lane because someone had told him to, because someone had marked the delivery for the cabin address, because there were tile orders that day for a bathroom renovation Beckett had not stopped even after his grandfather had died, and someone at the tile company had entered the address wrong. Or, the driver stopped near the young Arkansas black, the one Emmett had planted with me, the one with 11 small green apples set on its branches, no bigger than marbles. He backed up to correct his angle. The rear tire caught the low branch. The tree bowed toward the ground. Then the trunk gave, right above the graft. I ran. I ran with the strap of my apron flapping. I ran with Judd behind me and Ansel behind him. I ran with my hands in front of me as if hands could catch a tree. I could not catch it. The trunk snapped backward with a small sound, small for what it was. I dropped into my knees in the wet grass beside the base. The driver climbed down, heavy set, sunglasses on top of his head. He looked at the tire. He was sorry, he said. He was so sorry. The paperwork had said 118. That had been the address. I looked at his paperwork, which he handed me because he did not know what else to do with his hands. The delivery slip was addressed to 118 Bell Orchard Lane. Beckett's signature was at the bottom. I looked up the hill, at the farmhouse, at the man standing on the back porch of the house our grandfather had left him, watching, with his hand up, not waving, just up. Judd went very still beside me. Ansel did not move at all, which is what a man does when he has decided the situation belongs to somebody else. I looked at the tree. I looked at the 11 small apples in the grass. I looked at the delivery slip. I looked at my brother on the hill. I stood up. I did not shake. I walked back to the shed. I got the heavy chain Ansel had used to secure the sprayer trailer. I dragged it across the mouth of Orchard Lane. I fed one end through a fence post on the west side. I fed the other end through the ring of an old gate hinge on the east side. Judd helped me tighten it. Ansel snapped a padlock through the loop without being asked. I painted a sign on a piece of scrap lumber before dark. The sign said in white paint on the porch before I hung it, 188 Bell Orchard Lane. All deliveries by appointment. Call first. I did not paint my phone number under it. I painted my grandmother's initials, MLW, because as of that Wednesday in the 51st hour after I had opened a cedar box in a shed and read a letter my grandfather had left for me on ordinary notebook paper, the cabin at the end of Bell Orchard Lane did not belong to Sadie Whitaker. Not really. It belonged to a woman who had died when I was 7, who had left her name on it, and who had left the name to me. I hung the sign on the chain. I locked the chain. I stood in the wet grass looking uphill at my brother, who lowered his hand and turned and went back inside the farmhouse and shut the door behind him. And then, exactly then, in that quiet moment on that Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang. Not Judd's number, not Ansel's, not Odette's, Beckett's. I did not answer it. Instead, I turned to face the wet orchard. I let the phone buzz until it stopped. The Arkansas black lay on its side behind me, its 11 apples in the grass, its bark torn just above the graft, its lower branches still living, its upper branches still living, because a tree does not know it is dead for a long time after the trunk gives. Emmett had planted it with me in the spring after my mother died. Girl, he had said that afternoon, my mother had hated these apples. She had said they were hard as baseballs. I had asked why we were planting one then. Because she had been wrong, he had answered. You kept them till Christmas. Ansel came up beside me. He did not put his hand on my shoulder, which was correct. He put his hand on the trunk of the tree. We could graft this, he said quiet. I looked at him. 6 branches were still healthy. The graft was clean. We would take cuttings today, heal them into damp sand, put them into rootstock in the spring. I would get 7 trees, different tree, same wood, same apples. He did not offer me anything else. Not an apology, not a reassurance, which was the closest thing to a promise anyone had made me in 14 months. I nodded. I put my hand on the trunk beside his. The bark was cold. The sap under it was not. I looked past his shoulder to the pantry window of the cabin, where behind the glass the pencil marks on the wall waited in the flat gray afternoon light. Marigold's rounded letters, Emmett's tilted ones, and underneath them both in a hand that had barely been able to hold a pencil in September of the year before 3 words. She'll find it. She'll find it. She'll find it. I turned away from the tree. I went back to the cabin. I took the picking bag with Marigold's initials down from the peg by the door. I put it over my shoulder. I walked out the back way into the west orchard, past the seckel pear, past the row of Grimes, past the stamen my grandfather had written about on the wall of the pantry 2 months before he stopped being able to walk. And when I got to the north row and the sky had started to bruise toward evening at the eastern edge, I stopped under the tallest tree and I looked up into its branches and I said out loud to a woman I could barely remember that I had found it. Grandma, I had found it. Somewhere behind me up at the top of the lane on the chain across the mouth of the road, the padlock ticked once in the cold, which was the sound of a door closing, which was the sound of a door opening, which was the sound my grandmother had put in the ground for me 40 years before, waiting for a girl who had not yet been born to hear it. I opened the cabin for the first Saturday market on the 3rd weekend of March, not because I was ready, because ready was a word for other people, and because I was down to $11 in cash and 43 in the checking account after paying Dale for the second half of the electric restoration. And because the pears were dropping, which is what pears do in March if you leave them too long, not the fruit, the blossoms, which fall in a soft yellow rain onto the wet grass if a woman is too busy learning her grandmother's ledger to remember what week it is. I stayed up on Friday night stamping paper bags, 200 of them, 50 at a time, ink pad, rubber stamp, address in the upper right corner, Marigold's three initials in the lower left, MLW. At 1 in the morning, Phyllis came down the lane in her old Cadillac. She parked at the top of the chain. She did not honk. She walked down, in her funeral coat, carrying a tray of pies. I had not ordered pies, I told her. She had not asked me. She had made 6. She was selling them tomorrow. I would take 20%. She had been standing in that kitchen since 8, and she would like to sit down. She sat down. She sat on my porch step in her coat with a pie tray balanced on her knees, and she did not say another word for 11 minutes, which was Phyllis's version of I love you, Sadie. Odette came at 4 in the morning. Ansel came at 4:30 in his truck with 2 folding tables Judd had brought over the night before and forgotten to unload. Judd came at 5 with the barbecue smoker he had bought 2 years ago on a whim and never used, and had figured out in his particular way that a cold March morning was exactly the right time to try it. By 6:30, the porch of the cabin was full. Pears in shallow baskets. 2 crates of the last of Marigold's stored apples from the barn cellar that Emmett had labeled by variety in his tilted hand. Jars of pear butter Odette put up from her own trees 2 Octobers ago because she had known, which was Odette's word for how she moved through the world. She had known. At 7, I opened the chain. The first car came at 7:04. The second came at 7:09. By 8, there were 14 cars in the wet field beside the cabin. Because Joe from the diner had told her feed route. Because Curtis had told his church. Because Phyllis had put a handwritten sign on the counter beside the register that said in her block letters, local fruit. Whittaker property, go early. And because word had moved through the county in the way word moves through a county, not through announcements, through the phone calls of women in their kitchens, in their bathrobes, at the counter with a cup of coffee. Have you heard? Sadie Whittaker, Marigold's cabin. Yes. That one. Yes. She opened it back up. At 8:30, the first of them arrived. I did not know her at first. A woman in her 70s. Tall, silver hair in a bun so tight it looked like a fist. Canvas coat. Boots caked with red clay from a driveway 3 counties away. She got out of a sedan I did not recognize. She walked up the path. She stood in front of the porch. She did not pick up a bag. She was Camille's daughter, she told me. Yes, ma'am. Her name was Loretta Hale. The porch went quiet. Odette, who was standing at the pear table, put down the jar in her hand. Judd, who was pouring the second batch of coffee from a percolator borrowed from Phyllis, looked up over the top of it. Ansel, who did not know either of the women in the porch photograph, but who had learned to read a room by watching his mother, took 2 steps back. Loretta Hale did not sit. She had not been up this lane in 36 years, she told me. Marigold had used to send her pears. She had left them on her porch on Sunday morning. She had not knocked. She had not made her thank her. She said it the way older women say important things, slowly, without contractions, as if the sentences might break if she said them too fast. In the winter of 1989, she had lost her Frank. I knew, I told her. How did I know? There was a ledger. Loretta closed her eyes. She stood very still on the wet grass in front of my porch. She opened her eyes. She asked if she could see it. I brought the ledger out to the porch rail. I opened it to the page marked with the blue tab. Loretta looked at the entry. Loretta Hale, widow, 6 months, left when ready. She did not touch the page. She looked up at the address plate above the door. She looked at me. Her voice had gone smaller by an entire octave. Marigold had never told her. She had done others. Ma'am, she had done 12 others. Loretta Hale put her hand on the porch rail. She did not sit. She asked for a bag. I gave her a bag. She filled it with 6 pairs. She paid me $18. Before she left, she pulled a 5 out of her pocket and pressed it into my hand. I was not to argue with her. She had been waiting 36 years for a place to put this. Then she walked down the wet grass to her car with a paper bag stamped 118 Bell Orchard Lane, and she drove out of the field, and she did not turn her head back. By 4 o'clock, we had done $314. Not enough for the roof. Not enough for the water line. Not enough for anything Ms. Hensley's estimate of the coming property tax on the west parcel would require of me by August. But it was enough for a piece of proof, which was the piece of proof I had been asked to bring without knowing I had been asked on a wall in September of the year before by a man who could barely hold a pencil. Odette stood on the porch at the end of the day, rag in hand. Marigold had used to say that the Saturday count did not matter, she told me. The Saturday witness did. I asked her what she had meant. She had meant that on the days a woman stops asking whether she has enough and starts telling other women that she is here, those women come. And they remember, and they come back, and they bring their daughters, and the daughters bring their daughters. She wiped the rag along the porch rail. I had had 38 witnesses today, she informed me, and one of them had been Loretta Hale, which meant by Wednesday I would have 60, and by the Saturday after that 90. I did not answer her, because a person does not know how to answer that kind of sentence when it lands. Beckett cut the extension cord on Sunday night. He came down after dark. He did not walk. He drove his pickup halfway down Orchard Lane. He got out with a pair of hedge trimmers. He cut the orange cord where it emerged from the barn wall. He drove back up. I found the cord in the morning. I did not call him. I called Ansel. Ansel came at 6, with a portable gasoline generator on the bed of his truck. He set it up in the shed. He wired it into the temporary panel Dale had put in. I was down to fuel cost until we got the electric company to run a new drop from the road, which they could do without going through my brother. It would cost me $200 up front and a raised rate for 6 months. I could afford that. I could not afford that, I told him. I could now, because I had done $314 in an afternoon, and I was going to do it again next Saturday. And the Saturday after that. He did not look at me when he said it, because a mechanic knows when a woman needs to be told what she is capable of by someone who is not looking at her face. Beckett filed on Tuesday. The papers came in an envelope from Ms. Hensley, who did not sign her name in the corner where the sender's name goes, because Ms. Hensley did not want it in writing that she had been the one to bring the papers down the lane. Because a woman who had notarized an amendment for a dead client was already in a place where her signature had weight it should not have had. The papers said obstruction of shared access, unauthorized removal of estate property, unauthorized commercial use of a residential inheritance. Beckett was asking a judge to order me to remove the chain. Beckett was asking a judge to order me to pay damages. Beckett was asking a judge to declare my grandmother's ledger the property of the estate, not mine. I read the papers on the porch at dusk with a cup of tea that Odette had made me and had refused to let me drink until I had finished reading. I read them twice. I laughed, which I had not expected to, because there was a specific line on the third page that said the plaintiff was suffering emotional distress arising from the defendant's use of shared family property. Beckett was suffering. In writing. I set the papers down. I looked at Odette across the porch step. I needed to know all 13, I told her. All 13 what? Names. Odette looked at me for a long moment. She looked past me at the address plate over the door. I was going to a town meeting, she said. I was. Then we had 4 days. She took my grandmother's ledger. She took the stack of photographs. She took the list on the back of the porch photograph. And in the 4 days between Tuesday and Saturday, Odette Marchand drove 1,083 miles. She drove to Winston-Salem. She drove to Asheville. She drove to Charlotte. She drove to a nursing home outside Greensboro. She drove to a farm town in the western half of the state that I had never heard of. She drove to a cul-de-sac in Raleigh with a mailbox shaped like a duck. She knocked on doors. She said in the voice she had used on my porch on that first afternoon in January that her name was Odette Marchand. Marigold Whitaker had taken her in 1980. She believed Marigold had taken them in too. Marigold's granddaughter needed their help. 9 women said no. 3 women cried. 2 women got in the car with her. One of them was Loretta Hale. The town of Bellwether held its town meeting on Thursday nights. The county held its planning commission meetings on the second Wednesday of the month. The Halston Development Group had asked for a special session, which was granted, which was called for the last Thursday in March, which was 6 days after Beckett cut the extension cord and 4 days after his lawsuit landed on my porch and 30 days into the extension of a deadline that a woman named Ms. Hensley had notarized after my grandfather had already died. The meeting was held in the Fellowship Hall of the Methodist Church downtown, which held 280 folding chairs, which had been set out in rows of 10, which were full by 6:45. I sat in the third row. Judd sat beside me. Odette sat beside him. Ansel sat behind me. Phyllis sat behind Ansel with her arms crossed and her funeral coat on, though it was not cold because Phyllis wore her funeral coat any time she felt she might need to be intimidating. The front row was reserved. Beckett sat there, on the aisle, in a new suit. Denise sat next to him, not in a green headband, in a dress the color of an old pear. Ms. Hensley sat 2 seats down from Denise with a briefcase across her knees. The Halston Development Group was represented by a woman named Charlotte Cardew. She wore an expensive gray suit and shoes that had come from a city, and she read from a prepared statement. And her prepared statement talked about jobs. It talked about tax revenue. It talked about the responsible stewardship of legacy properties. It talked about the transformative potential of a boutique resort on a piece of land that had been, and I quote, dormant and underutilized for 3 decades. She used the word underutilized 4 times. I counted. At one point, she showed a rendering of what the cabin would become, which was not a cabin, it was a spa, with a plunge pool, where the pantry wall would have been, with a fire pit, where the shed had stood, with a curated apple tasting experience, where the north row was. The curated apple tasting experience in the rendering was priced at $85 per person. Beckett was invited to speak. He walked to the front of the fellowship hall. He had prepared. His grandfather had worked his whole life to make a farm that would take care of his family after he was gone, Beckett told the room. The reality was our family could not maintain a working orchard. His siblings and he had professions elsewhere. Our sister had been unemployed for over a year. Our father, who would have inherited the farm, had passed before our grandfather. The most responsible thing we could do as stewards of a legacy that was bigger than any one of us was to place this land in the hands of a group that could restore it, preserve it, and make it into something the whole county could be proud of. He was good at it. I had forgotten Beckett was good at things like this. He had been the president of his high school class. He had been the treasurer of the fraternity at UNC Greensboro that took him in when nobody else did. He had been the salesman of the year at his firm 2 years running. I knew how to speak to a room of 280 people the way a preacher speaks to a room of 280 people, which is to say, he knew that the trick was not to convince them. The trick was to make it look from the back of the room like they had already been convinced, and that a person disagreeing with him would be disagreeing with the room, not with him. Denise did not look at him while he spoke, which I noted, which I would remember. He finished his statement with the phrase that his sister would be signing the amendment tomorrow. On behalf of the family, on behalf of his grandfather, in the spirit of what he would have wanted. He sat down. Charlotte Cardew nodded. Ms. Hensley did not turn her head. The room began to applaud, not loudly, politely, the way small-town people applaud when they are not sure yet which side of the applause they are on, and want to be able to argue later that they were on the other one. The chair of the Planning Commission, a bald man named Marvin Weller, tapped his gavel. Public comment, he announced. 3 minutes per speaker, Sadie Whitaker. I was on the list. I stood up, I walked to the front of the hall. I did not have a prepared statement. I had a ledger. I set it on the podium. I looked out at 280 faces, at my brother in a new suit in the front row, at my sister-in-law in a pear-colored dress not looking at him, at Ms. Hensley holding a briefcase across her knees, as if the briefcase might defend her, at Loretta Hale in the fifth row from the back, where Odette had put her, at three women I did not know in the sixth row from the back, whom Odette had brought, whom I had not met until an hour ago in the parking lot, where they had waited in Odette's car until I got there, because they had wanted to see me first. At the rest of the room, fluorescent light, wet coats over the backs of chairs, a folding chair someone had put a purse on, the fellowship hall of a Methodist church, ordinary. I opened the ledger to the page marked with the blue tab, where Marigold had written LH 1989, widow, 6 months, left when ready, my grandmother's name. I told the microphone was Marigold Louise Whitaker. The room quieted. She had died in 2012. When I was 7, she had been 72 years old. The room was very still. She had owned this cabin. My grandmother, not my grandfather. She had bought it and the 9¾ acres of orchard around it in 1975. In her name. Alone. Recorded in the county register on July 7th of that year. Charlotte Cardew's face did something, very small. It was there and then not there. In 1985, she had written a will. She had named a granddaughter, unnamed as of yet, as the sole beneficiary of the cabin in the West Orchard. Beckett moved in his seat. I did not look at him. In 1980, my grandmother had taken a 17-year-old girl into that cabin because the girl's father had put her suitcase on the porch of her own house, because the girl was pregnant, because there was nowhere else for her to go. I looked at Odette. Odette did not stand up because she and I had agreed on the order of it. Between 1980 and 2010, my grandmother had taken 13 women into that cabin, some for a week, some for a year. None of them had paid her anything, not one of them. All of them had left when they were ready. All of them had left with a job, or a family, or a place to go. I looked at the ledger. I read the initials aloud. I did not use the full names, because I had promised Odette I would not. Because 13 women in a county of 30,000 people is 13 women whose neighbors do not need to have their business shared in a fellowship hall. But I read the years. 1980, 1989, 1991, 1993, 1996, 1997, 1999, 2001, 2003, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2010. 13 years, 13 sets of initials, 13 photographs, which I had brought, which I laid on the podium beside the ledger. Some of them were here tonight. The room stopped breathing. I did not look at Odette. Odette stood up. From the third row, her name was Odette Marchand, 1980. The room turned its head toward her. She did not sit down. In the sixth row from the back, a woman in her 50s stood up. Small, round-shouldered. She wore a cardigan with a button missing at the bottom. Rita Kessler, 1991. A woman 2 seats down from Rita stood up. Corinne Talbot, 1993. The 2 other women Odette had brought stood up one after the other and gave their names and gave their years. 5 women, standing. I looked at Loretta Hale in the 5th row from the back. Loretta Hale stood up. She was 74 years old. Her hands were shaking, but her voice when it came did not. Loretta Hale, she told the room. 1989. And she had not known. She had not known about any of them. She had not known that a woman she had thanked with a jar of jam in 1990 had been doing this for others. She had not known until Wednesday, when Sadie Whitaker had sat her down on her porch and let her read a ledger. That woman had saved her, and she had not known she had saved them too. Loretta was crying. She did not sit down while she was crying. She stood in the fifth row from the back in a canvas coat, and she told the room into 280 people who did not know what to do with the sound of her sobbing that they would not build a spa on that cabin. They would not. The room broke. I could hear it. I could feel it in the wood of the podium under my hands. My grandmother had made her work have a name, I said into the microphone quiet, because I did not need to be loud anymore. She had got an address for it, because she had said her work deserved one. That cabin did not belong to me. Not really. That cabin belonged to 13 women, and to my grandmother, and to whoever came up the lane next, and to whoever came up the lane after that. I put the cassette tape on the podium, beside the ledger, beside the photographs. I had a recording, I told them, from my grandfather, made in September of 2023, 2 months before his stroke, in which he said in his own voice that Beckett had been offering to buy the cabin from him for 6 years, in which he said no, in which he said he had torn up the papers Beckett brought him in November, in which he said, quote, "Do not sell, not for any price." Ms. Hensley set her briefcase on the floor, very quietly. The chair of the Planning Commission asked if I was making an accusation about the amendment. I was not the one who should be making that accusation, I told him. I looked at Judd. Judd was already standing, because Judd had been ready to stand for 2 months, and he had been waiting for me to tell him it was time. Judd walked to the front of the fellowship hall. He had not put on a new suit. He had put on Emmett's coat. He stood at the podium beside me. He did not take the microphone from me. He leaned into it from my side. His voice found the room easier than any of us had expected. His brother had come home on the night of November 12th, 2023, which was a Sunday. He remembered because the football game was on. He remembered because Grandpa had asked him to bring dinner up because Sadie was working the closing shift at the diner. He remembered because he was standing in the pantry putting away a can of soup when Beckett had come in the back door. And he remembered what he had said next, to Grandpa, in the living room, which he could hear from the pantry. The room did not breathe. Beckett had said Grandpa was not thinking clearly. Beckett had said Grandpa had not been thinking clearly for a while, and that Beckett was the one holding this family together while Grandpa was not thinking clearly, which meant Beckett needed Grandpa to sign this. Because if Grandpa did not sign this, Beckett had already lost the deposit, and Beckett was not going to be the one who lost the deposit for Grandpa. Beckett was going to be the one who saved the family. Sign it, Grandpa, sign it. Judd's voice did not shake, which was the most surprising thing, because I had never once in 27 years heard Judd's voice not shake in a room with more than 11 people in it. Grandpa had not signed it, he continued. Grandpa had torn it in half, and then in half again, and then Grandpa had thrown it at Beckett, and then Beckett had left, and Judd had stood in the pantry until he heard the truck go up the driveway, and then he had gone into the living room, and Grandpa had been crying, which Judd had not seen him do since Grandma Marigold died, and Grandpa had looked at him, and Grandpa had told him, Judd, if you ever tell your sister about this, I will not forgive you. Not until she has the box. Not until she has the address. And Judd had not told me about it, because he had given his grandfather his word, and because he had been a coward. Both things were true. Judd looked at Beckett in the front row. Beckett was not moving. Beckett was not looking up. 3 days later, Judd went on, Grandpa had had his stroke, and I had come home, and I had quit school, and I had taken care of him for 14 months, because I was the one who could. And you, Beckett, you did not come down to the farmhouse, not once, not in 14 months, not to sit with him, not to feed him, not to change him, not to help her, because you were waiting. Judd stopped. Judd took a breath. You were waiting for him to die, because the deadline on your paperwork was ticking, because you had already lost your deposit once, because you had guaranteed it personally, because the only way for you to get out was to consolidate title. And you could not consolidate title without her signature. And you could not get her signature until Grandpa was dead. So you waited. The room was so quiet I could hear the fluorescent hum in the ceiling. That was not a family, Judd told him. That was a countdown. He stepped back from the podium. Denise, in her pear-colored dress in the front row, put both her hands over her face. Ms. Hensley did not lift her briefcase back onto her knees. The chair of the Planning Commission cleared his throat. Given the developments this evening, he asked Ms. Cardew, did Halston Development wish to continue with its presentation? Charlotte Cardew stood up. She smoothed her expensive gray suit. She glanced at Beckett, whose face was in his hands. She glanced at Ms. Hensley, who did not look up from the floor. She glanced at the 6 women standing in a fellowship hall in a small town in North Carolina. 5 of them still standing. One of them, Loretta Hale, gripping the metal folding chair in front of her to hold herself upright. Charlotte Cardew was a woman with a job to do. But Charlotte Cardew was also a woman who could count. Halston Development Group formally withdrew its offer, she said into the microphone at her seat, without walking back to the front of the room. Effective immediately. They thanked the commission for its time. She picked up her briefcase. She walked out of the fellowship hall. She did not look back. Beckett stood up. He did not look at me. He did not look at Judd. He did not look at his wife. He walked out of the fellowship hall. Denise did not follow him. She stayed in the front row, with her hands over her face, where she did not look up when the meeting adjourned, where she was still sitting when Odette walked past her, and when Loretta Hale walked past her, and when the fellowship hall began to empty in a slow, stunned quiet that did not know what to do with itself. I walked up to her. I sat in the empty seat beside her. I did not touch her. I said her name. She did not answer. She had come to my porch 2 months ago, I reminded her quiet, and she had told me, which meant she had known, which meant she had already made a choice, which meant she was already standing on the other side of something, which was where I was. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet in the way that makeup does not survive. There was a lot of work to do on that cabin, I told her. If she wanted to help, she would like to help. I stood up. I offered her my hand. She did not take it. She took her purse instead, which was how a woman who had spent 6 years standing on the wrong side of something took the first step of standing on the right side, slowly, under her own weight, without needing to be pulled. We walked out of the fellowship hall together. Behind us, the folding chairs stood empty, in their neat rows, in a small-town Methodist church on a Thursday night in March, in a county where 13 women had spent 45 years knowing what a cabin was for. 6 months later. I want you to picture it, not the cabin the way you saw it in January, the cabin the way it looked in September of the year that is coming. New tin on the roof, painted the same faded green as the shutters. The porch rail rebuilt with cedar boards Ansel had milled for me in his father's shop. The chain across Orchard Lane replaced with an ordinary swinging gate, because the chain had done its work. And because a gate says something a chain does not, which is you are welcome, please close it behind you, the address plate above the door, straight now, because Odette Marchand had insisted on it. Girl, she had said in her particular voice, a woman who runs a shelter puts her sign up level. Marigold would have leveled it. So we were leveling it. We had leveled it. The pantry wall, behind glass, the way it had been when Judd had first mounted the panel over it, except Marigold's rounded letters had been joined by a new hand. My hand. I had begun writing on the wall too, in pencil, below Emmett's tilted letters. The first name I wrote was Rhea Prine. She was 17 years old. She came up the lane on a Sunday afternoon in July. Her parents had told her she had 3 days to be gone. She had a duffel bag. She had $240. She had a plastic bag with a positive pregnancy test in it. She had walked from the bus station in Bellwether, 3.5 miles. She did not knock on the cabin door. She sat down on the porch step. I found her there when I came back from the barn. I sat down beside her. I did not ask her anything. A woman at the library had told her to come here. Rhea offered, eventually quiet. She had said this was the address. It was, I told her. She was welcome. We had a spare bed. We had hot water now. We had a bathroom that flushed. which was not something I would have promised her 6 months ago, but which was something I could promise her today. Rhea Prine cried. She did not cry the way Loretta Hale had cried at the town meeting. She cried the way a 17-year-old cries when she has been told she has to leave her own house. I let her. I did not touch her. I did not tell her it would be all right. Because a woman does not need to be told it will be all right at the beginning. A woman needs to be given a bed, and a door that locks, and a kitchen, and a name for what she is doing, which was what Marigold had known, which was what I had learned, which was what I was writing on a wall. The second name I wrote was Loretta Hale, not because Loretta needed a place to live, because Loretta's son had come to her house in August, and he had said in the same tone Beckett had used with our grandfather in November of the year before, that his mother was not thinking clearly. She had not been thinking clearly for a while, so she should sign this, because he was the one holding this family together. He had put a durable power of attorney in front of her. He had said the words assisted living. He had said the words for your own safety. Loretta had signed it. Because a 74-year-old woman who has been told by her own son that her house is not hers anymore does not always know that she has the right to say no. Because a woman who has been kind for 51 years is not always sure whether kindness has a limit. He put her in a facility outside Greensboro. He put her house on the market. He said on the phone to the realtor that he had waited long enough. Loretta called me from the facility on a Thursday morning. She had done a foolish thing, she confessed to me. No, ma'am, she had not. She had done what somebody had made her do. I was going to drive down there in an hour, I told her, and I was going to bring her home, which was not her home, not yet, because we had to talk to a lawyer about her home, but which was a home, which was mine, which was Marigold's, which was hers if she wanted it. Loretta's voice was smaller than she was. She did not know how to accept help. Neither had I said, ma'am, so we could learn together. I brought her home that afternoon. Odette had made up the second bedroom, which was the small one at the back of the cabin, which had once been where women slept who came up the lane with a suitcase somebody had put on the porch for them. Loretta Hale sat down on the edge of the bed, very slowly, as if the bed itself might resent her weight. She looked at the picking bag hanging from the peg beside the door. That had been Marigold's, yes ma'am. It had her name in it now too, if she wanted to use it. Loretta Hale, who had lost her husband in the winter of 1989, and who had received 6 pairs every Sunday morning of the 4 months that followed from a woman who did not knock, and who had spent 36 years believing that kindness was the private currency of the dead, and who had just been put into a nursing home by her own son and been extracted from it by her dead best friend's granddaughter, put her face in her hands and cried the way older women cry, which is to say, quietly and without wasting anything. I sat down on the floor at her feet. She was to take her time, I told her. She took her time. By the end of the year, the cabin had 4 beds. Rhea Prine slept in the front bedroom with her baby, a boy, 6 weeks old at Christmas. She had named him Emmett. She had asked me first. I had asked Judd. Judd had cried on the phone, which he had denied later, which had made him cry again. Loretta Hale slept in the back bedroom. Odette drove up 3 days a week from the town where she had lived for the last 39 years. She taught Rhea how to hold a pruning saw. She taught Loretta how to fill the sprayer tank without breaking her back. She taught me how to keep a ledger the way Marigold had kept a ledger, which was without judgment, and with initials, and with the year, and with one single line, left when ready. We called it Marigold's Row. Not officially. There was no sign. There would never be a sign, because a sign is a thing a woman needs when she is inviting the public. And this cabin was not for the public, but among ourselves, on the porch, in the kitchen, on the phone at night to women who had heard through friends of friends of friends, to librarians, to pastors' wives, to the woman at the domestic violence hotline in the next county, to nurses at 3 hospitals, to one guidance counselor at a high school in Winston-Salem who called me every 8 weeks to check. Among ourselves, we called it Marigold's Row, because we could, because we had. Beckett came down the lane on a Sunday afternoon in October. I saw him from the porch. He walked. He did not drive. He walked all the way down from the farmhouse in a pair of boots that were older than his marriage, in a barn coat I had not seen him in since he was in high school. He stopped 10 feet from the porch. He did not come up the steps. He looked at the address plate above my door, which had been leveled, which was clean, which was mine. He looked at the picking bag hanging from the peg beside the door. He held out his hand. In his hand was a picking bag, older, bigger, the strap repaired with black thread. Emmett's initials stitched inside the flap in a hand that had not learned to sew from a book. Marigold stitching, Marigold's bag. For Emmett. He had found it in the barn, he told me. That was Grandpa's, I answered. It had been in the barn since he was a kid. He had thought it should be down here. I did not move for a long moment, because a Whitaker walking down a lane with a picking bag in October is a Whitaker doing what a Whitaker cannot say. I stepped down off the porch. I walked to the bottom of the steps. I took the bag from him. I did not thank him. I did not have to. The stay man needed thinning, I offered instead, in the north row, if he wanted to. He did not know how to thin a stayman. I would show him. He did not deserve to be shown. That was true, but he had asked. He looked at me. I looked at him. I did not say the sentence he wanted to hear. I did not say that I forgave him. I did not say that the amendment did not matter. I did not say that I understood, because I did not, and I would not. And a woman who has been given a cabin on purpose does not owe her brother the forgiveness he did not ask for. But I told him to come on. We walked into the west orchard together. We walked past the Seckle pear, past the row of Grimes, past the young stamen I had overpruned in March, which had responded as Ansel had said it would by sending up a forest of hopeful vertical shoots, which I had learned to leave alone. We walked past the graft where the Arkansas black had once stood, which was now 7 small trees, grown from cuttings Ansel had helped me take on the January afternoon a tile truck had come down the lane, which were 4 feet tall now, which were one of them showing a first small set of buds for the spring. I did not point to it. I did not have to. Beckett saw it. He stopped. He did not touch it. It had grown back, he said quietly. It had grown different. He nodded. We went on to the stamen. I do not know if my brother and I will ever be what our grandfather wanted us to be. I do not know if we will ever be what our grandmother wanted us to be either. We may not. Some things take longer to grow back than a tree does. Some things take a whole life to graft. But I know this. On a Sunday afternoon in October, in a west orchard in the Blue Ridge foothills of North Carolina, my oldest brother put on my grandfather's picking bag and let me show him how to thin a stamen apple tree. And he did it without a word, and he did it with my grandmother's needle marks on the leather of the strap against his shoulder. And when we were done, he handed me back the bag, and he walked up the lane to his farmhouse, and I walked into my cabin. And Rhea Prine was at the kitchen table with the baby, and Loretta Hale was on the porch with a cup of tea, and Odette was standing at the sink in a canvas coat, and the address plate above the door was straight, and it was ours. If you are watching this, and you have ever been given a piece of your family that nobody else wanted, look at it again. Sometimes what looks like the piece nobody wanted is the piece somebody hid for you on purpose. Sometimes the leaking roof and the peeling paint in the address that does not match the main house is exactly where the love was left. By a woman who could not tell you out loud. By a man who could not hold a pencil at the end. Look again. And if you know a woman who has been told this year that her house is not hers, or her name is not hers, or her share of the family is smaller than she thought, or her son has come to her kitchen with a piece of paper and a tone of voice, or her father put her suitcase on the porch, or her husband has died and she is alone in a house too big for one person and nobody has thought to leave her 6 pears on a Sunday morning, please, please tell her. Tell her that this cabin exists, in a form, somewhere. Tell her that her work has a name, that her name has an address, that her address is not the address of the people who forgot her. My grandmother spent 30 years making a place for women who had been told they did not have one. I did not know her. I was 7 years old when she died, but I know her now, and she left me an address. 118 Bell Orchard Lane, which is not just mine. It is for her. It is for you. It is for the girl who is walking up a lane right now in a coat too thin for the season, in a county I do not live in, with a suitcase somebody else put on the porch for her. Because Marigold Louise Whitaker was right. Her work deserved a name. And now, by the grace of a stubborn old man who could barely hold a pencil, and a middle brother who kept a promise for 2 months longer than he wanted to, and an older woman who drove 1,000 miles in 4 days, and a mechanic with a scar through his eyebrow who could graft a broken tree, and a sister-in-law who chose the right side of a fellowship hall, and a diner owner who baked 6 pies on a Friday night, and 13 women who let their initials stand in a ledger, and a girl who walked 3.5 miles from a bus station with a positive pregnancy test in her hand. By all of those graces, her work has a name, and so does mine. The cabin light was on when I closed the front door that night in October. Rhea was reading to the baby on the couch. Loretta was pouring the tea. Odette was drying her hands on a dish towel with an embroidered pear at one corner. 3 women in a cabin at the end of a lane. A fourth if you counted the baby. A fifth if you counted me. A 14th if you counted my grandmother, whose picture hangs above the kitchen door in her checked shirt, with her hands on a crate of apples in 1980 on a porch a girl named Odette had just walked up to for the first time. Marigold Louise Whitaker, 1940, 2012, beloved, which is what the stone at her grave says, but which is not what the cabin says. The cabin says something else. The cabin says come in. The cabin says take off your coat. The cabin says this is 118 Bell Orchard Lane, and it has been waiting for you for a long time.